Good evening. We're glad everybody is here. I thanked Stephanie when she came in from Boston this morning for bringing sunshine, which I couldn't even find my sunglasses. It's been so long since I needed those, so we have her to thank. Would like to welcome you to the first annual Baldwin Wallace Faith and Life Lecture. And I'm glad some of you have a sense of humor. There are others who were here the first time saying, what does that mean? That was an inside joke, and I'm really counting on it being an easy evening, and that we'll finish the way I imagine we'll finish. So if anybody else has ideas to the contrary, will you please tell me so I can be prepared? Another inside joke, so enough of those. We've done well this year, and part of the proof in that is Stephanie Paulsell, who's sitting behind me, and will bring a lecture tonight as well as tomorrow morning in this room at 10, and then at 2 o'clock we'll be in the Student Union, where we have a panel of 5 students who are going to pose really tough and ornery questions that Stephanie will develop mini lectures to respond to, and then she'll leave and go home. So we hope that you can make it for all 3, and if not, that glad to have you here this evening, and if you can manage 10 o'clock tomorrow or 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, I'm sure they'll be equally as good. Should just tell you the parking situation is obviously a little ornerier than it used to be. I said the good news is the university still has money to do some remodeling and that sort of thing, which is always one of the things you look for in a university, so that suggests that we are healthy, we're doing fine. Restrooms are now 2 floors below us, so the level you walked in, you can't find a restroom, so you have to go all the way down for restrooms if you need that. As I counted on the back of the bulletin, it looks like this is the 26th annual lecture. I've been here 13, which means now I've brought half of the people here. And I was thinking earlier and shared with faculty and some alums who are back in our midst, which is just a delight to have some of our religion majors and minors as alums back. But I was thinking, you know, these lectures are really just an occasion for me often to invite one of my friends to come back so that other friends will join us and we'll just have a really interesting discussion over a couple days. And such is it with Stephanie, whom I'll introduce a little more formally in a minute. The history really goes back to a man and a woman, Theo and Belle Moll, whom I never met. But the chair was established in their honor in the mid-'80s. Mark Collier, who's with us, would remember those days, and some others. But it really was to honor the life of a couple who gave immensely to the college in time and talent. I hear stories about Theo as a trustee, as a person who cared deeply about the college, as a member of Rocky River Methodist Church, and it's really humbling to think that we are still sharing the legacy of that life and that witness and the people who gave the money to make this an ongoing event. So I'm grateful to a couple whom I never met. And such is the nature of life, isn't it, so often? So we're glad you're here. The other thing I would just add, there's some fine print, I think it's on the inside of the bulletin, about something like coffee and pastry at 9:15. And for those of us who have done that in the past, it's way more than coffee and pastry. So there are, again, some people looking after our welfare. So if you want to come a little earlier in the morning, you'll get a lot out of it, even before Stephanie starts speaking at 10. So I invite you to do that. As I indicated, Stephanie is a friend of mine. I met Stephanie and began to get to know her much better because we're both members of a professional society called the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality. It's a bit daunting. I served for a few years on the board of governors, and Stephanie joined me, and then she became a real leader in the organization. The thing I really like about spirituality, and I suspect Stephanie would underscore this, is spirituality is that academic discipline that also tries to give some real attention to the practical, lived out aspect of the religious tradition. So the thing I like about Stephanie is she comes as an academician, comes from Harvard, and yet she's an ordained minister, works with seminarians in terms of ministry, So she's really concerned with that lived out in the real world endeavors of those seminarians. And I suspect we'll get glimpses of both Stephanie, the person who has a PhD and is the academician, and also Stephanie, the woman who's involved in ministry and I'm sure effectively involved. As I introduce people, I don't see any reason to read what is printed. You all can read about her books, her degrees. I thought I would try to give you a sense for who she is as a person before she steps up here and really embodies that. We in the Quaker tradition will talk about the inward journey and the outward journey, and I think that suggests something about the nature of Stephanie. She's a mother, has a 16-year-old daughter that I've begun to learn a bit about as the day has gone on. So that's a good aspect. Anybody who's become a mother knows more about real life than many of us, so I give her that credit. You can read about her dad on the front cover. Her dad was a pastor, taught religion, and as Stephanie was with those of us who gathered for our weekly religion colloquium, which includes the 4 religion faculty, my colleagues, and some members of the department, students, and some of the alums. Stephanie talked about growing up on an academic campus with a father who was a religion professor with all the religion majors and minors hanging out in her living room, so she felt right at home in the lobby below us. So she's a mother. She had a dad who does the kinds of things that she did, and then she also had an upbringing in a period that's different than ours, and I thought I would read finally just a snippet that will give us a taste for Stephanie, and I think she'll probably come back to some of this stuff as it goes along. It's amazing what you can find on Google these days. I was old enough to know when Google wasn't even a word, and now it's a verb. You can Google something, and so you just Google Stephanie, and all sorts of interesting things pop up. It only took about 10 minutes to find this last night. Stephanie says, in the summer of 1970, the year I was to enter the 2nd grade, my hometown closed the schools. The last week of August came and went, and we children all remained at home. During the 16 years since Brown versus Board of Education, my hometown of Wilson, North Carolina, had moved with slow reluctance towards integration. It was 12 years after the United States Supreme Court ruled the concept of separate but equal unconstitutional before Wilson took its first step towards integrating its schools. And even then, Wilson, like many other towns and counties in the South, did only the minimum. It offered school choice, but it did not actively assign children to different schools. Finally, the courts insisted the Wilson public schools must integrate. My hometown responded by shutting the doors of all of its schools and locking them tight. When the town refused to give to our parents any indication of when the schools would reopen, my parents sent me to a Roman Catholic school named for Saint Therese of Lisieux, a saint who lived in France in the late 19th century, a Carmelite nun who entered a monastery at age 15 and died of tuberculosis at age 24, and became famous for the little way to God that she wrote about in her autobiography. St. Therese Catholic School was already integrated. And so began the pilgrimage of Stephanie Pausell, who comes to us tonight as a mature woman of faith ministering in our midst. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to everyone who's shown me such great hospitality today. I have had a wonderful day at Baldwin Wallace, and loved being with the students this afternoon, and look forward to our conversation tonight and tomorrow. So thank you for coming out on such a cold night. I'm very grateful to Alan Culp and John Gordon, my dear colleagues from the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality, for extending this invitation to me. And I'm grateful to my student, Caitlin Carver. Where are you? Yeah, there you are. Who is a student at Harvard Divinity School and absolutely setting the place on fire with her brilliance. I'm looking for more Caitlin Carvers, so if you are she, please speak to me afterwards. I would like to recruit more BW students for our school. I want to just say a word about the lectures. The overall title is Lost in the Mystery of God. And I want to start tonight by talking about that theme in relation to the history of childhood in the history of Christian spirituality. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about St. Therese, whose school, as Alan mentioned, I went to in the second grade, who is known as kind of a child saint, a bit unfairly, I think, and I'll talk about that a bit. But I've been thinking a lot about childhood, my own childhood, my sister's childhood, my daughter's childhood, and childhood generally, and trying to find there some resources for my spirituality in these days. And so I hope to invite you into that conversation, and hopefully this will help you think about your own childhood. I'm tremendously honored to be asked to speak in this lecture series. The other lecturers who preceded me are some of my favorite writers and thinkers, and it is daunting to follow them. One last word of introduction to these lectures. Alan has already mentioned the 1970s. These lectures have some narrative parts in them where I reflect on my childhood, and a lot of the action is happening around 1969, 1970, 1971, 72. Now, I know for many of you, the 1970s are an historical period about which you might take a class. My daughter's a sophomore in high school. She's taking a class on the 80s, okay? But some of you, I think, will remember that these were the days when Lyndon Johnson's presidency was ending and Richard Nixon's was beginning. It was the days of the Vietnam War, the beginning of our secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos. Simon and Garfunkel, the Beatles, the Carpenters were at the top of the pop charts. We were watching MASH and All in the Family and The Brady Bunch on TV. So if you do remember those days, that's the scene for the narrative bits of these lectures. So thank you again. It's really, really wonderful to be here. It's hot, but not as hot as it's going to get. We're driving from Wilson to Oak City in the early morning, my dad and I. The windows of our green Impala wound down, fields of bright leaf tobacco shimmering in the heat on either side of the road. Most are nearly picked clean by migrant workers and local kids, moving through the fields again and again, harvesting leaves from the bottom up. A few fields are neglected, the flowers growing out of the tops of the plants, making breezy accusations of laziness and inattention. It's Sunday morning. Except for the rattle and whine of insects, all the fields are quiet. Oak City Christian Church is between pastors, and my dad is filling their pulpit. His plain, black, hardback Bible lies in the seat between us, his sermon neatly folded up between its pages. Some Sundays we hurtle through the humming green morning without saying much, just watching the fields go by and the fragile-looking barns where the tobacco will hang to cure. Other Sundays, we're more talkative. Once my dad told me about walking over the knob of a hill at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky just as the setting sun washed the valley below in one last flood of brilliant light, and he felt God's presence just as surely as he had ever felt anything. Sometimes I ask questions. Dad, do you think there's really a hell? No, he'd answer. Why would God build a permanent place for evil? This was the catechism of the car. Back in the 17th century, the English poet and pastor George Herbert advised preachers to dip and season all their words and sentences in their hearts, so that the congregation may plainly perceive that every word is heart deep. My dad types his sermons on a manual typewriter and then, with a pen in his hand, tests the depth his words have reached, scratching out, filling in. Even as a child, I can see that this heart-deep work gets rewarded with attention. In Oak City, there's one young man in particular, in his late teens or maybe his early 20s, who leans forward in the pew, his chin in his hands, eyes bright when my dad preaches. He looks like he would drink every word like water if he could. This morning in Oak City, my dad is preaching my favorite of his sermons, Lost in the Mystery of God. I've heard him preach it in other churches, but I haven't gotten tired of it yet. This is what my dad wants for all of us, whether we work on a farm or teach in a school, whether we are an adult or a child, that we be lost in the mystery of God. Not that we use our beliefs to protect ourselves from the difficult world, but that we become so lost in the mystery of God that we become permeable, available, vulnerable to what is really real. I want to be lost like that. I've tried a few things, turning in circles in the front yard until I fall down, dizzy and drunk on the spinning earth. Swinging in the swing set my dad set up for my sister and me in the backyard, chanting, "Narnia, Narnia," in the hopes that I would suddenly break through. Pressing my hands against my closed eyes as I lay in bed, watching chips of pink and blue swirl against the dark. Kneeling in the woods behind our house, a cathedral of pine trees, building altars of moss and mud in its side chapels, well off the paths where the neighborhood boys raced around on banana seat bikes, playing cards clipped to their wheel spokes for maximum racket. We pull into the dirt parking lot of Oak City Christian Church, and an elder smoking under the oak trees stubs out his cigarette and comes to greet us. "Morning, preacher," he says. "Going to be a hot one." "Sure is," my dad replies. Once inside, my dad disappears to do whatever it is ministers do behind the scenes before the service starts. I find a place in the pew that will be easy for him to see from the pulpit, on the aisle, about halfway up. When the organ music starts and he walks out into the chancel with the elder who will lead the service, the first thing he does is look for me and catch my eye and smile. I wish I could remember the words of the sermon he preached that morning. When I asked recently if I could read a copy of Lost in the Mystery of God, my dad told me that he had destroyed all his early sermons when, after decades of teaching, he became pastor of a church in Indiana. He didn't want to be tempted to pull an old one out of the bin on Saturday night instead of writing something new. I find this wildly overscrupulous. Lost in the Mystery of God preached well in churches across eastern North Carolina when my dad was busy teaching and writing and chairing a religion department and helping my mom raise my sister and me. Propelled out onto the back roads of eastern North Carolina by a vocation I could see clearly as a child and an economic need that is more visible to me now as an adult, he had to have a bin to dip into. So many church parking lots we pulled into on so many Sunday mornings with Lost in the Mystery of God folded up between the pages of my father's Bible. Gold Point, Goldsboro, Wendell, Wilson, Greenville, Rocky Mount, Kinston, Morehead City. Nobody suffered from such bin dipping, it seems to me, and I wish I could read it again. My dad can't even remember what the scripture text was for Lost in the Mystery of God. My mom thinks the text was from the Psalms, and I think she's right. My dad loves the Psalms. They take us all the way in and all the way down, his friend Matthew Kelty, a Trappist monk, liked to say, shining a light into every corner of ourselves. If we can't face it, my dad asks, as he looks out at congregations that are largely rural, largely white, wholly Southern, how will we ever be able to change? But every time I bring up this lost sermon and its lost text, my dad says, if we still had that sermon, it wouldn't look as wonderful to you as it does in your memory. Like many books I've read and loved, I don't remember the words of the sermon, but I do remember how it made me feel. It made me feel like the world was opening up all around me on every side. It made me believe that it was the work of a lifetime to seek the presence of the living God and that there was nothing better to which one could devote one's life. It taught me that there were 1,000 places to seek that presence, in fields and barns, in marriages and families, in acts of mercy and justice, in books, in scripture, in music, in silence, in prayer, certainly in the Psalms. It convinced me that God's presence is a mystery so deep that we can swim and swim in it our whole lives long and never sound the bottom. We may feel God's claim on us, but we can never fully understand God or know God's mind. The mystery of God, the really real, can't be put in a box. The world is full of faithful people. I've heard my dad preach from the pulpit, some Christian, some not. Anyone who has had an experience of God has something wonderful to teach us. That sermon made me want to be better, more loving, more understanding, more good. It made me want to take risks for what is right. It made me want to pray. It made me want to kneel with all the devoted everywhere. It made me want to lose myself in the mystery of God. After the last hymn and the invitation to join the church, my dad stands at the door to greet folks as they leave, and I walk out into sunshine so bright it blinds me. Now it is as hot as it is going to get. Everything that shimmered in the early morning sunshine, the fields, the barns, the church, the trees, is flattened and drained of color in the noonday heat. Even with the windows rolled all the way down, our car is a furnace, and my dad touches the baked steering wheel gently, gingerly, as we follow the car of a family in the church to their home for lunch. The house is cooled by shade trees, and the food is delicious. Fried chicken, green beans, boiled potatoes, coleslaw, fried cornbread and hush puppies drying on paper towels, pie. My father thanks God for the food and the company and God's own sweet presence, and we start passing the food like we're still in church, serving one another. But this time, there is more than we can eat. The table conversation always begins the same way, with the adults asking me and the other kids at the table how things are going in school. After we deliver our monosyllabic answers, avoiding one another's eyes, the conversation inevitably turns to tobacco. Tobacco's over. I remember one farmer saying, "We'd do better to plant marijuana." If there are children in the family close to my age, my time at the table is mercifully short. After we're excused, we disappear into pink bedrooms with the frilly canopy beds that I secretly covet and play board games or Barbies, or climb up 2x4s nailed to the trunk of a pine tree to reach a treehouse built in its branches, or race up and down the rows of tobacco fields behind the house. If I'm lucky, the kids will show me their treasures, a pet snake, a litter of kittens, a secret stash of cigarettes. Once I remember squatting with another girl in a ditch that ran below a train track, pressing wet leaves between flat rocks and imagining the people thousands of years hence who would find our ready-made fossils, wondering if they would wonder about us. By 2:30 or 3, my dad and I are usually on our way back home, quiet after a day full of words. Once home, Dad would disappear into the back bedroom to take a nap, and I'd curl up with a book or play records in my room. Once, I remember taking a sheet of loose-leaf notebook paper, writing "Lost in the Mystery of God" across the top line, and filling half the page with my own sermon. I can see it in my memory. One long paragraph in little girl looping cursive. But like my father's sermon, my sermon is lost too. Now, at the heart of much, and maybe even most, scholarship on religion, there is a child hiding. That child might be one whose early religious experience was marked by absorption in a very deep joy, or a child who trembled in his bed for fear of his salvation, or a child who wondered where God was hiding as a parent or sibling sickened and died, or a child on whose body the religious convictions of the adults around her were violently tested. The child hidden in the work of the scholar of religion might be one who found the religious instruction he was offered so enervating and absurd that he couldn't wait until he was old enough to refuse it. Or a child whose observation of religious practices in the lives of those around her or in her own life wrote a question so deeply into her heart that it could not be ignored. The hallways of religious studies departments are thick with ghosts, Robert Orsi writes, in between heaven and earth. The ghosts whom Orsi calls our invisible conversation partners, as real as the saints and spirits and ancestors of the religious worlds we study, include, as he reminds us, the adults in whose company our religious ideas, questions, and desires took shape. But they also include the children that we once were. Now, there are many difficulties about trying to use one's childhood or anybody's childhood as a source for the study of religion. As Rebecca Nye has pointed out, a key problem for study in the area of childhood and spirituality is the lack of evidence in children's own voices. As Nye puts it, children are even more vulnerable than women to being unheard, silenced, spoken for by others, or to believing they must speak in a voice approved by others in order to be heard. Much of what we know of childhood, certainly of our own childhood, but also the childhoods of those we study, is mediated to us through the memory, language, and voice of an adult. Compounding that difficulty is the fact that the dangers of attempting to say something about childhood are very real. As one historian has put it, our capacity to sentimentalize, identify with, project onto, and reify children is almost infinite. Try to say something about childhood and spirituality, and the problems compound. Expressions of what adults want for children so often betray what we want from children. We look to children to provide us, as Jacqueline Rose has put it, with the answers we need to guarantee a certain knowledge of ourselves, to reassure us that what we believe is true, or to assure us that our faith has a future. We see this in scholarly treatments of, for example, Thérèse of Lisieux, who we'll be talking about in the morning. The editors and the readers who seem to need Thérèse to confirm something essential about childhood faith really didn't want her to grow up. She became trapped by those interpreters in a perpetual childhood of purity and innocence that made it difficult to hear her when she expressed her own desires, her desire to be a saint, her desire to be a priest, her desire to survive the tuberculosis that was killing her, her desire to live as a Carmelite in Hanoi, her desire to carry out the work of faith, even as she felt the joy of faith slipping away from her irrevocably. How difficult it is to avoid these dangers, and how easy to essentialize or romanticize childhood can be seen in the complicated inheritance of Christian thinking about childhood. Childhood has come to bear many meanings within the history of Christian thought, but there are a few key trajectories that have their roots in the New Testament and carry a wide cultural influence. One trajectory, arguably the most important and influential, certainly in our day, finds its founding story in the synoptic gospel stories about Jesus and children, stories which point to a kind of privileged spiritual status of childhood. These are the stories where Jesus insists to the disciples that unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Or where he welcomes children who have been brought to him for a blessing, saying, "It is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." Or when Jesus claims such a deep identification between himself and children that whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. These stories are cherished within Christian communities, and no wonder. They offer a compelling picture of children as the keys to the kingdom. It's not the powerful we should imitate, not ecclesiastical or political leaders, not even teachers and scholars, but children. These were the first Bible stories I ever read to my daughter because I wanted her to see herself in the light of Jesus' wide open welcome to children. I wanted her to know that she was already very near to God. But what is it about children that so suits them for the kingdom? Except for one reference to humility in Matthew 18, verse 4, whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, the Gospels don't really say. Their silence on this point leaves ample room for interpretation, as anyone who has ever preached on these stories knows. Within the history of Christian thought, theological catalogs of the special gifts of childhood are numerous. For Reformed theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, these gifts include an ability to live in the present moment, which for Schleiermacher was a mark of the eternal life. The past disappears for the child, Schleiermacher wrote, and of the future he knows nothing. Each moment exists only for itself. And this accounts for the blessedness of a soul in innocence. Children's lived experience of basic dependence is also a key quality of childhood that Schleiermacher believed would give them a foundation for understanding their relationship to God. He also praised their ability to experience, quote, the full range of emotional life without repression. Roman Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, one of the few Christian theologians in the 20th century who worked on any kind of sustained theological treatment of childhood, wrote in 1962 an essay called Ideas for a Theology of Childhood, in which he described what he called strange and wonderful flowers of childhood that are already fruits in themselves. Childhood, for Rahner, is in the last analysis a mystery, a theme to which I will return. But Rahner does fill that mystery with a lot of content. For Rahner, childhood is openness, even infinite openness. The characteristics of childhood that he urges us to integrate into our lives and as adults take the form, Rahner says, of trust, of openness, of expectation, of readiness to be controlled by another, of interior harmony and the unpredictable forces within which the individual finds himself confronted. For Rahner, the graces of childhood include freedom, receptivity, and a hope free of disillusionment. Now, both Schleiermacher and Rahner have much more than this to say about childhood, but I lift them up as representative of a theological desire to name in a general theoretical way the characteristics of childhood that position children towards God. Emerging from synoptic gospel stories of Jesus, welcoming children and encouraging his followers to become like children, these catalogs fill the empty space Jesus' words leave behind and give childhood a particular content, a spiritual content. Now, there's so much that is attractive in these accounts of childhood. The child living wholly in the present, without anxiety about the past or the future, free from repression in her emotional life, and enjoying an experience of basic dependence, a readiness to be controlled by another, as Rahner calls it. This is a portrait of childhood safely held, the source of a deepening relationship with God over a lifetime. And these general characteristics of childhood may resonate with the childhood experience of some of us, or at least express our hopes for how the children in our lives will receive and interpret the world. But they simply cannot survive scrutiny in the light of the complexities of particular childhoods. Furthermore, these general ahistorical appeals to openness, innocence, contentment, and trust are themselves so open as to be vulnerable to being filled not with the lived experience of children, but with adult fantasies about childhood and children. If Rahner had lived through the exposure of the widespread sexual abuse of children in churches, it is hard to imagine that he would have appealed to the readiness to be controlled by another as a characteristic of childhood to be cherished and imitated. Empty categories of innocence and openness are not just vulnerable to being filled by adult sexual fantasies. They also make childhood and children vulnerable to religious fantasies, as the history of the study of Thérèse of Lisieux shows so powerfully. Caught in a sort of perennial childhood, Thérèse was not allowed by some of her interpreters and admirers to grow up. This, of course, is one of the primary difficulties of giving childhood a privileged spiritual status. If children are more fit for the kingdom of heaven than adults, then maturation, growing up, as Robert Orsi puts it, can only be seen as a fall from grace. If the tropes that Christians have often used to speak of childhood, innocence, purity, openness, compromise children's own interiorities, desires, and autonomies, and blur the boundaries between adult religious fantasies and the lives of children, how might we, as students of Christian spirituality, contribute to the articulation of childhood that takes the lived experience of children in all its uncontrollability into account? How can we resist the tendency to sentimentalize, to fill the idea of childhood with our religious fantasies? How can we reflect on childhood and spirituality in a way that honors the complexity of childhood experience, while at the same time leaving room for authentic consideration both of children's religious experience and the adult reappropriation of our own? To help us and to conclude, I will turn to a figure in the history of Christian spirituality who may seem the least likely to help us, because his relationship to childhood has been so controversial. Augustine of Hippo, who often shocks and even angers his readers with his account of what Martha Stortz has called the non-innocence of children, and what one of my students once called his obsession with evil babies. If you've ever read Augustine's Confessions, you know what that is about. Augustine was frustrated because he couldn't remember being a baby, and so he watched other babies to see what babies are like, and he didn't think they behaved very well. Often criticized for what Stortz has called his rather dour assessment of childhood, Augustine of Hippo offers one of the more sustained meditations on childhood in the history and literature of Christian spirituality. It's a sign of the power of the human desire that children be innocent, that Augustine, because he refuses to call them innocent, has come to stand incorrectly, according to Stortz, for the position that children are naturally depraved. It is precisely his refusal of childhood innocence, however, that offers a way of taking childhood seriously as part of both the subject matter and the self-implicating demands of our field without resorting to a religious essentializing of childhood. Karl Rahner described childhood as a mystery with two beginnings: the absolute origin of the individual, and the beginning which plunges its roots into a history over which the individual has no control. It's precisely the mystery of these beginnings that stimulates Augustine's reflections on his childhood in his Confessions. "I do not know where I came from into this mortal life," he writes. "I myself do not remember." The fact that he can't remember this crucial time of his life drives his meditation on childhood. You probably know the stories. Augustine tries to learn about his early days by asking those who cared for him what he was like and by watching other babies. He watches them smile, nurse, eye each other jealously across the breast, and draws inferences about what his own infancy, including the sins of his infancy, must have been like. That his infancy is so utterly lost to him, and yet still a part of him, preoccupies him chapter after chapter. "And now my infancy has been long dead, while I still live," he marvels. "Should I say my boyhood grew in me, replacing infancy? For infancy did not go away. Where could it have gone?" The transition from infancy to childhood is a transition from no language to language. And with language comes education. His first attempts at prayer, he prays not to be beaten at school. That prayer, unfortunately, was not answered. And interaction with other children, other boys. There is much that he regrets about his boyhood and adolescence, stealing the pears, of course, but also his vulnerability to the power of literature. He remembers being absorbed in the wanderings of Aeneas, while remaining oblivious to his own. He remembers weeping over Dido, but being unable to spare a tear for Christ's passion. Looking back, he regards the pleasures of reading as among the deadly pleasures, in the enjoyment of which we become separated from you. So yes, as many of his readers have pointed out, he is quite hard on himself, so small a boy, as he puts it, and so great a sinner. In his own reflection on Matthew's Jesus, commending the humility of children as what fits them for the kingdom, Augustine reasons that Jesus must have been thinking of children's low stature when he told the disciples they must become humble like a child in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, because he certainly could not have meant that the virtue of humility was a universal characteristic of children. By construing humility not as a particular virtue of childhood, but a social status imposed on children by society, Augustine gives that story a political resonance. And those of you in the Religion Colloquium who are studying liberation theology, this is an early example, little proto-liberation theology here in Augustine. Entry into the kingdom is not based for Augustine on a particularly childlike way of being in the world. Children will be first in this reading because in terms of worldly power, they are the least, and the least are cherished by God. Now, although Augustine does not claim a special spiritual status for children, he also does not claim a special sort of sinfulness for children. If there is no innocence of boyhood, as he claims, it is because the sins of children are so very like the sins of adults. The difference is only contextual. Children's sins are enacted among tutors, schoolmasters, footballs, nuts, and pet sparrows, while the sins of adults are made visible in relation to magistrates and kings, gold, estates, and slaves. The consequences may vary, but the sins are the same, or at least have strong family resemblances. As Margaret Miles pointed out in her study of the Confessions, it is notable that this identification of the sins of children with the sins of adults evokes from Augustine not a judgmental response, but a compassionate one. No one is sorry for the children, he writes. No one is sorry for the older people. No one is sorry for them both. The sinfulness of children was part of the human condition for Augustine. If we are all born into original sin, then there is no amount of purity that we can identify within our embodied eternal earthly lives, not even when we are nursing infants. And so he claims no special spiritual status for children. He also recognizes the good that was in him as a child. Truth delighted me, he writes. I hated to be deceived. I had a vigorous memory. I was educated in speech, and I was made tractable by kindness. Contrary to some readings of the Confessions, Augustine's account of his childhood was not simply an unrelieved losing battle with his sinful nature. What I think is potentially helpful to us as we consider the place of childhood in the human attempt to reach out towards God is not the content with which Augustine did or did not fill the idea of childhood, but the way reflection on the specificity of his childhood became for him a path to God. This is not because of any special spiritual characteristics of children, but because for the adult Augustine, childhood is, in a sense, lost. Infancy is utterly lost, and even what he called his speaking boyhood cannot be recalled completely, even for one in possession of such a vigorous memory. For Augustine, attention to childhood and meditation on childhood is a spiritual practice, a way to draw near to God. But it is not a practice that can be appropriated through theoretical categories of openness or innocence. It can only be appropriated through attention to childhood in its specificity, in its moments of anxiety and disappointment and fear, as much as its moments of joyful absorption and connection and trust, in moments of independence as well as dependence. All of these childhood experiences, the joyful and the terrible, are held or lost, if I may borrow a phrase from my father, lost in the mystery of God. If Augustine is to remember them and question them and hold them up to the light, then it is to God he must go. He can't remember being a child, but God can. God is holding his memories. Knowledge of his childhood is not possible without knowledge of God. The search for the hidden child within his work cannot be uncoupled from his search for God. Augustine conducts this dual search within, but that does not mean he stays there, absorbed only in his own memories. His meditation on childhood leads him inward towards God and outward towards others. When he knows himself as containing a childhood that is partially lost to him, but wholly held in God, he can see others as full of mysteries as well. Maybe that's why his story is so full of the stories of others. The interiority he cultivates in his meditation on childhood is not a hollow inner space, but a critical self-presence, the kind of presence to oneself that makes authentic engagement with what is not ourselves possible. It is the capacity both to dwell in God and be a place in the world where God dwells. In 1923, the British novelist and poet Walter de la Mare published an anthology of poetry for children called Come Hither. The introduction is written in the voice of a man who, when he was a boy, set out in search of a place called East Dean, an anagram for destiny, finds a great house called Thray, an anagram for earth, presided over by a woman named Miss Taroon, nature, who invites him to explore the room of her absent relative, Nahum Taroon, human nature. There the boy finds 3 homemade volumes called The Other World, books full of poems and notes on poems written out in Nahum Taroon's own hand. Studying Nahum Taroon's favorite poems, the boy learns to read slowly, to hear and see all that the words were saying. He learns to join his imagination to a poem, to appreciate the way form shapes meaning, and he comes to realize that a poem may have as many different meanings as there are different minds. He copies out the poems he likes best, and that collection, culled from Nahum Taroon's collection, becomes Walter de la Mare's book. Now, the poem that opens the anthology is maybe one that you know. It's a nursery rhyme that serves as a key to the book itself. A gift from a fictional child to the real child holding the book in his or her hands. The rhyme is called This is the Key. It's a dandelion rhyme, one that de la Mare imagines as the kind of rhyme Japheth's wife might have sung to little Magog as she bounced him on her lap and waited for the floodwaters to recede from beneath the ark. It's also the kind of rhyme it's possible to imagine might have had its origin in the play of children. This is the key of the kingdom. In that kingdom is a city. In that city is a town. In that town there is a street. In that street there winds a lane. In that lane there is a yard. In that yard there is a house. In that house there is a room. In that room an empty bed. And on that bed, a basket of sweet flowers, of flowers, of flowers, a basket of sweet flowers. Flowers in a basket, basket on the bed, bed in the chamber, chamber in the house, house in the weedy yard, yard in the winding lane, lane in the broad street, street in the high town, town in the city, city in the kingdom. This is the key of the kingdom. Of the kingdom, this is the key. The child hidden in our work, all your work, all you students and teachers, readers, all. Whether she is nudging us to rewrite her lost sermon, or to seek the answer to a question posed to her long ago, or to find truer, more precise language to account for the spiritual lives of children, or to see the many hidden children all around us, the migrant children who worked in the tobacco fields of my childhood, for example. This child is trying to tell us that there is no shortcut to that basket of sweet flowers, and no shorthand to describe the way childhood unfolds. Interior life is embedded in the body, which is embedded in the community, which is embedded in histories and political and social realities. Both the move inward to a greater self-knowledge and the move outward toward a greater consciousness of others take us through the broad street and the high town, the weedy yard and the winding lane. These are places students of spirituality should not avoid, and especially not in our consideration of childhood. The pear trees, the tobacco fields, the borderlands that shape particular childhoods in particular times and places matter. The more precisely we can imagine them, the better chance we will have of imagining and caring about the multiple possibilities childhood holds. For if we approach this work as Augustine did, as a spiritual discipline, that which is lost in the mystery of God might lead us ever more deeply into the mystery of one another. This is the key of the kingdom. Of the kingdom, this is the key. Thank you very much.